Hashtag visual effects. Hashtag not my Star Wars. Well, hello everybody. Recently, I went to Disney World, which has a Star Wars thing. And I thought, this is for me. This is for my visual effects. I'm talking those big metal dogs. I don't like Star Wars. I don't know what they're called. But I could have gone pew pew, and then there was a tower that could have gone pew pew. And a lot of it didn't need visual effects because you have these like real life animatronics. So in this video, I want to talk about how to make a dust storm. Did that work? Okay, and I know that the intro sequence also had other stuff going on. There was a BB-8 there. If you stick through the dust stuff, I promise you I will also show you how to model and rig in a procedural way, how to do that for a BB-8. And before we begin, the project files are down here on the floor. Go to www.cgmatter.com to get not only the BB-8 model, but also the project files for the whole intro sequence. Okay, let us begin. Here we go.
This video is sponsored by Brilliant. More about that later. Welcome everybody to the tutorial. This is the footage I want to process and do the dust storm of. And this is a bit of a technical challenge because to make this look like a dust storm, I've identified 3 elements. The first one is getting these particles. The second one is getting this volumetric fog. And then, of course, the third one is doing a massive color grade. That, by the way, is inspired by this thing from Blade Runner 2049. Very orange, very kind of embery. And the big issue is a lot of this, what I've been saying, is dependent on us knowing the depth of the shot. Like fog accumulates as you look further into the distance. That is information we don't have, except I have a 3D model of the scene, but we're not using that. So we're gonna need a workaround. Well, one thing at a time, I'm gonna start with motion tracking, so go to the movie clip editor and literally drag in your footage. I would recommend hitting set scene frames and prefetch, which will just say, oh, it's 117 frames apparently, and now it's all in memory. Other things is in the render tab, just set this to standard. It doesn't affect tracking at all, but it makes it more visually the same as how we filmed it. Now, I could go over how to track and stuff like that. Like normally I hit normalize, I say control click here, and then, you track forwards, but there's a faster way to explain motion tracking. I'm gonna use this detect features button. What that does is it adds a bunch of trackers for me that, I can then have it do the dirty work. Very tiny bit of a crash course. When I control click, it adds a tracker that has a search area that's shown with Alt S. In other words, I'm looking for this pattern within this region for every single frame. So whatever settings I pick here, like if I pick a giant pattern size, it's gonna spawn in with that. Just pick like pretty big trackers and also hit normalize. Now, when I detect features, it's gonna inherit those settings. So with detect features, I'm gonna say, just get a whole bunch of them. So I'm gonna say, bring the threshold down, which says, you don't need to be picky. If it's good enough, just throw it in. And when you have your trackers, you control T. And look at that, to lock these trackers, in other words saying, this is good, I'm gonna keep them, hit Control L. You can see in the graph information, we now have a mess of data. You can interpret the red as the X coordinates of the tracker, Y as the green as the Y coordinates. This one seems like very off of the main bundle of data, so I would select this tracker, which by the way, as you select trackers, it will select them in the scene. I'm gonna take these high error ones and just hit X to delete. There's a technical art to this, but if it looks like, wow, this is the wrong data, just delete it. It should all look fairly similar to each other. I'm going to go to the last frame, once again detect features, and you can either hit track backwards, or instead of Control T, you hit Shift Control T to say go backwards. Control L to lock those, and now you can see we have new outliers, and just kind of get rid of those. We can say take this data and try to figure out how the camera was moving. To do this, go to the Solve tab because we're done tracking, and there's a whole technical art to this, but what you need to know is that these are certain settings that guide our camera solve. So for example, we're going to ask, do you want to figure out the focal length? How zoomed in was it? To start off, I'm going to enable keyframe, which will decide these 2 numbers for me, and I'm going to hit solve camera motion. And you can see it gave a solve error of 3.8, which, if you don't know, isn't great. You want to get to 1 pixel or below. You can think of this as how much does it drift on every frame, but I'm going to disable this to say keep these keyframes, and I'm going to say now that this is constrained, also try to figure out how zoomed in it was. So I'm going to solve camera motion, and now we're way lower at 1.89. It guessed that my lens was like 31 millimeters. It was iPhone footage. This is fairly accurate. To get a better solve, we can either add trackers manually, like high quality trackers, or we could try to get rid of high error ones again that, kind of slip through. If you don't want to select these yourself, you can go to the solve panel, filter tracks, and then you could say, oh, how bad does a track need to be selected? So I'm saying let's make this really high. In other words, only select the trackers that have really, really high deviation. X, delete, and you can see it basically selected the bad ones pretty well. If your error is still high, what you can do is you can say for every tracker, show me your info. In other words, your error. I can then take trackers that are of high error, in other words, higher than 2.47, and I can get rid of those. So 3.53, pretty bad. You know what's really bad? A tracker of like 16. And just with that, I solve camera motion, and we're down by a significant margin. 2.69 is pretty bad. It's not awful. So instead of deleting it, I'm going to say the weight. In other words, how much should you consider this? I'm going to say consider it 0.25. It's only a quarter as good. And I only did this for like 4 trackers. Let's solve again. And we went from 1.78 down to 1.5. So just kind of keep repeating this process. Okay, I did it enough. We're at 0.92 solve error. So once we have this, how do we take this and put it in our 3D scene? Well, you just take it and you say, set it up. So set up tracking scene, and you can see not much changed, but now this camera is moving. And if I go into the camera, you can see it's tracked. It looks a bit off, and there's a reason for that. The reason that it's off, by the way, is we're assuming the ground plane is right here. Whereas if I move the camera, it could have been up here or down here, and those will give different results. Take 3 trackers that are on the floor. They kind of make a triangle. Take those and say, this was the floor all along. And now you can see it's tracking on much better. And then from this point on, you can do some manual adjustment. Take this and rotate it by the 3D cursor. What I mean by this is now when I pivot, it pivots around the middle. I'm just going to spin this until our coordinates are nice, move it on the y-axis, and now we have a very good camera solve. This is great because I can put 3D things into my scene, like this cube, for example, and that will track on, and that includes things like our particles and our fog.
So you know how we've been taking footage and using the magic of AI to create a depth pass? Well, these kinds of models have been more and more interesting to me, and it seems like the foundation of all of these is PyTorch, which I'll be honest, I don't know much about, but the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant, might change that, because Brilliant is all about learning certain skills that tend to revolve around math, science, programming, LLMs, and all this, and specifically, they have a very beginner-friendly learn how to use Python module. Ultimately, the goal is to learn PyTorch, which of course means you need to learn Python, and then assuming you just have data of any kind, you can train a model that does magic. Personally, that is one of my goals. I don't know what I'd train, but I just think it would be cool. And again, it's tailored to make learning very easy, and you can take it on the go if you want to, so desktop, phone, whatever, and that's what's up. So if you want to try Brilliant, you can use a link in the description to get 30 days for a free trial, and then when you want to take that and go further, you get a 20% off annual membership as well, all under the same link. So let us continue.
Let's make some particles. And what is a particle storm other than a bunch of points that are rushing towards the camera? Let's take this bad boy and rotate it so it's facing our camera, and say distribute a bunch of points on these on this face. So let's bring that up a lot, and now we just have to have this rush towards the camera. In other words, it should be going down on the y-axis. Set position of these points. If I apply rotation, now it's perfectly aligned, and I don't want them all to move together, but instead I want it to be kind of randomized. So instead of just saying one value for y, let's randomize that bad boy going from 0 to -1. If I now add a contribution or subtract it, this whole mass goes forwards or backwards. Instead of kind of keyframing this, which would be a pain, I'm going to add in a time node, which will bring in the seconds, and now woof, they're off. I'm gonna set this to subtract so they're going in the correct direction. Finally, they shouldn't all be moving at the same speed. Take the speed factor and I'm gonna multiply it by, again, another random value, going from like a quarter speed to full speed. Now, one issue we have is these kind of go towards the camera and then they keep going and we run out of particles. What if we said that you start here and you travel, but once you're about here, like you're past the camera, you can loop back to the beginning, almost like you're doing this Pac-Man kind of thing? Well, to do that, keep the fractional component, and now look at that. Amazing. Stretch it using a multiplication, and now check that bad boy out. I can literally just reposition it, and now it's a storm going towards the camera. Now we have particles going towards the camera, but one, they're not fast enough, and two, they look very uniform. Well, what about instead of just setting position on the Y, I also do the X or maybe the Z, but in a random way? How do I do that? I just do a vector math. I'm going to add a contribution of noise, just random fucking noise. Boom. You scale this contribution and all of a sudden you have this like nice randomness. By the way, if you see this going up and to the right, that's because it's trying to normalize this from 0 to 1, which I don't want. I'm going to disable this and now it's nice and centered. I can make this noise 4-dimensional, which means now we have this W slider, so it animates over time, like the dust is picking up different wind directions or whatever. This is also going to be subject to time, and if it's going too fast, you're saying take that animation and make it slower. Time should go 2 times slower. And now we have something more interesting, but they're all the same size. So I'm going to set the point radius. In other words, how big are these? And I'm going to set them to a random value between 0 and I think it was 0.05. Let's even go a bit smaller. And motion blur, by the way, is what's going to really take this over the top. Let's do a render. All our points are going to look like, they're going to look like tiny little spheres, which you might think, oh, the dust should be a different shape. It doesn't matter. It's going to be motion blurred. You're not going to see it. Let's get rid of the background so that these are isolated and give them a very visible material, because we're just going to do this in compositing. I'm going to set material to a material that I am going to call dust. And I'm literally just going to make them white because I'm going to do compositing later. And note that because this is all procedural, I can say take the density and say make like 4 times more particles. And now we have more dust than we had before. And let's see what this looks like. Render. There you go. So you have this blast just coming at you, which looks like this without any special compositing. Now, you might wonder, where did this come from? How does it know what the background is, etc.? Well, when you hit setup tracking scene, it did all this nonsense. It added a background collection, a foreground collection. It added both of these scenes. I'm going to get rid of the background and I'm going to call this foreground. You can't see this under my head. I'm going to call this dust, and I'm going to call my object dust as well. Finally, in the compositing tab, this is the last area it affected. You see it took the footage. It said, make sure to undistort it and scale it to the scene. Neither of these are important to us. And now we have a super simple system where our compositing is saying, take our footage and then overlay the dust, which we need to render again. And now you can see one is on top of the other. And we're eventually going to start compositing this. For example, I'm going to multiply this by the color red or orange or whatever. And, we've already changed the color of this footage. But before we get into compositing, I want to also do the fog, which I swear is much easier. I'm going to make a copy of this scene. This one is going to be called fog. And for all your dust stuff, I'm going to put it in a collection called dust. The reason for this is I want this to be disabled in this fog scene. So I'm going to hit E to, hide it, which will still keep it in dust, right? These are independent from each other. And then I'm going to also add a fog object, which right now will be a cube. This can be in the fog collection, which will be hidden here, but visible in the fog. Make this cube way bigger so it fully consumes the camera. Make a material. I'm going to use a principled volume, which will already kind of add this very dense fog that you can soften. I would recommend adding in a sun. As this brightens up, you can really see the fog here. And then finally, to break this up and have it look more chaotic in a sense, I'm going to use a noise texture, which by the way, also works with volumes. If I connect this to the density and then disable normalize, you can see we already have fog, which can become much more detailed and much rougher. And then we can take this final result and say make it weaker by multiplying by a tiny number. And to me, this is looking pretty good. And the thing to realize is that this moves with our camera. That's the special thing about it. In compositing, I'm also going to add a render layer for the fog. So let's just do a render and see what that looks like. So it's going to render the particles, and now it's going to render the fog, which will take a bit longer. We can now go into compositing, and we not only have our dust, but also our fog, right? For example, I could take this, I could then say mix over maybe the color orange for this kind of fog area. So something like that. So this is before and after. Of course, we're going to take this further. Now, we have run into a roadblock here where we have these assets, they're in our scene, but we never modeled our scene. So we don't know the depth of it. Again, fog accumulates over distance. The dust has to be behind or in front of objects. So am I really going to model this whole scene? The answer is no. We're going to use AI. I'm going to link this in the description, but there is a Hugging Face space, which basically means somebody set this up for you, called Depth Crafter. If you look at the GitHub repo, you can see, whoa, this calculates depth of footage without knowing anything about it. And it really, really is pretty good. So here is our footage. Note that this is a pretty kind of heavy process. If you make your resolution too high, your GPU is not going to be able to handle it, basically. Instead of making this 1920 by 1080, which is my resolution, I'm going to bring it down to 720p at 1280. Additionally, my footage is 30 FPS, so I wanted to do all of these frames. And with that, I can hit generate, and it will take about a minute. And we'll see how successful this process is. Took about a minute and a half to process this, and are you fucking kidding me? Love it or hate it, I'm a proponent of use AI when it's like, do you really want to model this? And yes, it is kind of like yellow and orange, kind of this thermal camera, but I just kind of care about the luminance. And now we actually have everything we need, and we're on step 3, which is compositing. Let's bring in our depth clip right here, and let's get organized. So we have our movie clip, that's just the original footage. We have our depth pass, we have our dust pass, and finally we have our fog pass. And we need to do some special combination of nodes that will put this all together in a nice way. This is footage with many frames, so I need to say, oh, it's like, I don't know, 200 frames long, I'm not sure. But now when I play, you can see we have video. This is also the case with the movie clip. And because this is 1920 by 1080, and this is 1280 by 720, you can see they're different sizes. I'm going to take this depth, and I'm going to scale it to say, make it 1920 by 1080. Fast way to do this is you say, make it the render size, which in this case is 1920 by 1080. So now we've normalized this in a sense where everything's the same scale. I'm going to take my depth and make it black and white. So I just say white as close close to the camera, black is far away. And with these pieces of information, we can now begin. I'm gonna start with my movie clip, and I wanna dye it this kind of sepia color. Because again, I wanna take inspiration from this. So it's sepia, it's yellow, it's all of this. The footage, I'm also going to make black and white. I'm gonna take it and multiply it by like an orange color. This is another way to say dye the footage. Next thing I wanna do is I wanna add some haze. Part of that, of course, involves this fog, which of course, if we overlay it as is, it's gonna look really weird. I'm gonna take my fog, I'm gonna overlay it and say do something like multiply or add. It's just gonna look really strange. What I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to take this fog, which by the way is supposed to be depth-based, and I'm gonna incorporate that. So because we have it so that white is close to the camera and black is far away, I kind of want to invert that. That's kind of weird. I'm going to invert this color, so now black is close to the camera, white is far away, and I am going to take this fog and multiply it by this factor, which you can see kind of added some depth to it, and the way we can do better is by playing with this gradient itself, which we can do any kind of manipulation to. For example, I could add a bit of offset. Another thing we can do is we can like multiply to get different intensities of the effect, so now you can see it's really showing up. You can even run this through a exponential, like a power, so now it's kind of like a cubic, so before, after, and we're not going to stop here. Again, we're going for this Dune or Blade Runner kind of color scheme. I'm going to take this, which again is basically just a black and white map, which is now modified by this fog, and I'm going to run it through a color ramp. Color ramp is going to let me color based on depth. So we can have red, we can have blue, and as these get kind of closer to each other, you can see we basically like dyed this footage. I want to pick the color palette of that image. One kind of trick to do this is you can hover over the color, hit E, and then you can literally just click and drag and it will collect all these colors for you. And that's fine, but I want to do it a bit more custom. For the far away sections, I'm going to pick this yellowish color. For something that is mid-range, I'm going to pick kind of this brownish color. And for things that are close, I'm going to pick this reddish color. One thing you're going to see is that this color ramp is really not optimized. We have to bring everything really close to the beginning, and that's because this is kind of squished between 0 and 1. Multiply our depth fog by like a big number, let's say 7, or maybe even 10, I don't know. Now, as we play with these sliders to get different looks, you're gonna see that the cutoff is really intense here, and this is an interpolation issue. If I turn this to ease, it's gonna be a bit softer. If I turn it to cardinal, it's gonna be a bit harsher. The trick for this, and it took me a while to figure it out, is you wanna use B-spline. This is the softest you can possibly get. So you can see these colors just kind of roll into each other once you pick kind of the right things. And there we go, now we have this really nice haze. And once you're happy with that, we have our sepia footage, we have this, and the name of the game is to kind of combine them. I am going to use a mix node that incorporates both of these like layers. I think screen looks the best among these. And now we're not done here. We can overlay this or mix it in a depth dependent way. Of course, that makes it way less intense. So I'm just going to multiply this by like a big number. And as this number gets bigger, it gets more and more crazy. By the way, if you see this like harshness over here, that is because this area is like pitch black. Whatever you want to do. So here I've inverted it. I could throw it through a color ramp, which again, I like setting it to B-spline for this nice like soft roll off. So before, after, I mean, just plugging it in directly looks pretty nice. Of course, it's very, very intense, but now we have kind of that nuclear fallout kind of thing going on. Okay, I like it. And remember, there's still a lot to do to this. Still a lot to do. One thing we can do is we can add a glare now that we have all this light to blend everything together. You want to be careful with this because it can be quite intense. I'm going to increase the size to make it as diffuse as possible. And then the way you make it less intense is a mix of -1 means no glare, a mix of 1 means only glare. So maybe like -0.8. And before we continue, let's clean this mess up with a nice node group. It now has these nice 3 inputs that are the fog, the depth, and then the sepia footage right here. So I can call this step adding fog. So let's take this dust and also augment it with our depth pass. For my depth, I'm going to make sure that it's resized, it's black and white. And now I need to think about this. Should the dust be more prevalent at far depths or at near depths? I guess like the dust would accumulate more visually as it goes deeper, but I want the dust to be really in your face. So maybe it's the closest, like in areas like this, or maybe the opposite. The beauty is we can play with it. So I'm just going to steal more nodes over here, multiply their contributions. So now it's kind of depth dependent. I can now mix in to the sepia footage. I can mix in the orange color where this is our mask. So now you can see before and after. I think the dust, ember, whatever should be a bit darker. And if you can't see it anymore because it's darker, you can literally take your mask and like make it 5 times more intense or whatever. So now we're really starting to see this dust and debris and whatever. Make sure to clamp this to not get like weird looking values. And now let's talk about some easy tricks to make this look better. So I think one thing is this is like high contrast. It's like too much. I'm going to take the view transform, which really makes it look different, by the way, depending on what you pick. I'm going to take this and make it Chronos PBR neutral, which seems to handle these kinds of bright intensity, saturation things quite well. And now we can also play with the gamma and the exposure because yes, this is good, but it doesn't look very like burnt and intense and whatever. And that is what the gamma is for. So this is what's going to make it look more or less like a hellscape. To bring in some detail, after the fog, I'm going to mix in. What do I want to mix in? Maybe I take the original footage and I'm going to make it black and white. I'm going to take this, I'm going to multiply it. So now we kind of brought in like too much detail back, and I'll bring it down to like 20%. So it just recovers some detail so it doesn't just look like insane fog all of a sudden. And I want you to remember, if there's anything you don't like about this image, it's highly, highly, highly customizable. It really is. So for example, I can take this fog, that too can have a brightness and contrast. If I bump this up to like 5, you can see already we get like a different look. The numbers are of great importance. Okay, so some final things before we just hit this with like camera shake and whatever. You add a bit of lens distortion or really dispersion. So as you increase dispersion, it creates kind of this chromatic aberration effect, which people like to really abuse. So keep this subtle and hit fit. You can also do general color correction with a hue saturation. So you can see this will darken the image, which might be nice. You definitely don't want to saturate this further. You can even make it more red by playing with the hue. So maybe like 0.49. Okay, I'm going to give this a few frames of render. And by the way, I am doing a second pass of compositing. We'll do it together in a second because luckily the dust storm goes, so it's fine to just mess up the footage, which helps us hide anything that looks bad. So this is what the render looked like, just kind of raw output, and it's already pretty good, but the thing is it's kind of too calm. Like the dust storm looks serious, but I'm filming it as if I don't care, like I'm just made of titanium. So this is where a second layer of compositing comes in. I'm using DaVinci Resolve. You can use whatever, just use the same concept. So to make this more chaotic, one, the camera should be shaking more. So in the effects, I'm going to first of all look up camera shake, add that in there, and now the camera is shaking extra because it's so intense and the wind's going crazy. Increase the speed and then increase the motion blur, which will make it crazy intense. Because it's moving so fast, I want each oscillation in itself to be tinier, so maybe 20%. So now it kind of looks like the camera's being affected by the wind more. Another thing I like to do is add PTR speed. I think that's rotation, hand tilt rotation, but now it looks much more intense than it did. So here is without, very calm, and here is with, just much more intense. Another thing we can do is, if it's dust and it's moving the camera, maybe it changes intensity. So I can do a flicker addition, almost like we're going through strobe lights. This is what that would look like. Of course, that's a bit ridiculous. So I'm going to speed it up. So it's kind of almost like lightning. And just like before, if it's too intense, you take the range and say, maybe not 0.2, but 0.1. And you just kind of judge it. So that's still like very intense. It's too eye-catching. So 0.05. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Another thing we can do is, I don't know, it seems like everybody nowadays is doing like lens blurs with the radial blurs. I don't know why. So I'm just going to throw it in there. Doesn't matter. A radial blur is exactly that. It's a blur that spins. You want to make it subtle enough that the viewer cannot tell. So before, after, that's still way too intense. Before, after. Make it subtle so that nobody's saying, oh, there's a weird radial blur there. Final thing that's just going to take it over the top is let's just destroy this footage with film grain. Like the camera's not supposed to capture all these details under these conditions. So add some film grain. If you look at grain only, you can see what's going on here. So you can play with the texture of it. You can play with the size of the grain. And most importantly, you can play with the grain strength. I'm going to just play around with these numbers until I like the look of it. And let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so already that just added chaos to what is really a very calm shot. Now, I lied. There's one more thing we can do, the 2.35 aspect ratio. I know I rendered this in a 16:9, but here I have an image of black bars, basically, and I just slapped them on. And I think this framing is quite good. Let's see what that looks like with aspect ratio bars. I mean, that's instantly cinematic, and we haven't even added audio yet.